He kept a second place at his table as if it were a promise. A chipped blue mug, a fork that had belonged to someone who hummed too loudly while washing dishes, a folded napkin tucked where a hand should have been. The empty chair across from Jack Rowan was a small, stubborn ritual, an acknowledgement that some absences are more honest when honored than when ignored. It was late, rain knitting itself to the diner windows in long, soft fingers, the yellow light inside pooling over formica and the steam of soup. Jack sat there most evenings, grease still ingrained under his nails, sleeves rolled, staring at a framed photograph propped on the counter. Sarah, hair pinned back, laugh caught in a candid. It was the kind of picture that felt like a hand on his shoulder, even on the days he thought he could stand on his own. Lila was with her grandparents tonight. School had kept the girl late. The chair across from him waited. The bell above the diner's door chimed. Two figures slipped in like wet shadows. One small, a boy with a soaked backpack. The other older, moving with the careful wariness of someone who had practiced shrinking to fit where there was room. They stood for a second by the counter, shaking rain from the hems of their coats, eyes searching. The room smelled of coffee and frying onions and the soft, ordinary safety of people who did not know they were being watched. Jack watched them, felt the old reflex, offer a smile, offer an empty seat, before he even knew he wanted to. He waved them over. "Come on in," he said, voice rough from garage air more than emotion. "You look like you could use a hot bowl." They took the seats opposite him. The boy introduced himself with the kind of polite that had been taught in uneven doses. Ethan, 6 years old. He knocked over a salt shaker and apologized without looking up. Grace, the woman, kept her gaze low, the way a person keeps a bruise hidden. She smiled once, quick, almost reflexive, and the light in the picture of Sarah seemed to lean toward it. Jack pushed his bowl of soup across. "2 extra bowls at my bill," he told the waitress. "On me." Grace thanked him like she had to gather the words from somewhere safe. She started, and then stopped, as if the whole story of why they were there might break if spoken aloud. He didn't press. He only tucked the reserved care's napkin tighter and, without any grand statements, left space for what might come next. "If this matters to you, share it with someone who believes small kindnesses can change things." After that night, they returned. Not like a movie where a stranger in need becomes a sudden bedrock of the town. It was smaller, slower, more real. Grace came on the recommendation of a friend who worked the late shift at the laundromat. She had a short, tired laugh that sounded like she expected the room to end any minute.
Ethan went to school with a backpack that had once been an overripe promise. Lila taught him to tie his shoes the wrong way at first, a trick that made him giggle and then learn the right way when she corrected him. Jack learned little facts that fit together like simple gears of a life. Grace had been living light for months, moving from sofa to shelter to a friend's cramped couch, all of it framed by phone calls she would take in the diner bathroom where the reverberation made tears sound like water. The father she had left was not written about on social media. His menacing presence had been a shadow that followed phone calls and late-night headlights. She had left because some nights will not let a child sleep if the house is loud with fear, and because a mother knows when the weight of worry begins to taste like harm. Jack gave what he could. At first it was soup and advice, where to find discounted diapers, a place to get a wary eye repaired on a car with a broken light. Marcus, who owned the bakery, watched Grace knead dough with a concentration that was almost reverent and offered her an early morning shift. "Come in at 4, Marcus said once, the steam of the ovens like a small baptism. Help me with the trays. You'll learn the morning, you'll learn the rhythm." The spare apartment above Jack's garage became an option when the landlord replaced the roof and found a leak that meant rent would be easier if someone watched the pipes. It was small, a room with a slanted ceiling and a window that looked over the alley. It smelled faintly of oil from the garage, but had a closet clean enough to hold life. Jack made a list of repairs the first weekend, fixed the cabinet hinges, replaced a light. He left a jar of sugar and a note on the counter. "If you ever need anything, knock. No explanations required." Grace knocked. The early mornings at the bakery taught her a new kind of endurance. The discipline of measuring, the kindness of a coworker who handed her a muffin when she looked tired, the joy in an oven that turned flour into something people lined up for. Ethan made friends with the kids from the elementary across the street. Lila, when she came over for a weekend, taught Ethan to ride his bike without training wheels, her hands hovering near him until he pedaled steady and confident. They were small miracles: scraped knees that healed quickly, a first sale at the bakery that paid for a new pair of sneakers, a bag of canned soup that appeared on the porch when Jack was out late. Life's ordinary stitches started to fill holes in both their hearts. For Jack, who had once been the kind of man who kept grief tucked like a neat tool, kindness did what he hadn't expected. It softened him in places he had rigidified. He found himself leaving an extra slice of pie on the counter of the bakery because he could imagine Sarah liking the taste of cinnamon on cold days.
For Grace, who had been learning to trust slippery things, the routine of working dawn to noon, coming home to a warm cup left in a jar, being able to call Marcus when she needed a shift covered, these gave her a new vocabulary: steady, dependable, safe. Neighbors noticed. Small towns have quiet radar for patterns. They watch doors, they watch porches, they watch a girl's bike left leaned against a fence. At first, the comments were the kind of curious that slid away when coffee cooled. "So Jack's helping them," Mrs. Patterson would say, not unkind, not unhelpful. But breath that has too long held a suspicion rustles itself into gossip. It started as a sideways glance at the garage as Grace and Ethan carried boxes up the alley. It was a whispered misinterpretation at the PTA meeting. It became a question raised to Jack in the garage. "You sure you ought to be letting them stay there? Folks are talking." Jack, who thought himself protected against small-town judgments because of the solidity of his grief ritual, felt a new ache. He had expected to be praised for all he had left: Sarah's kindness, his own steadiness. He had not expected suspicion like an extra weight. Grace felt it too. She bristled inwardly, shrinking against it, as if she might be accused of taking the charity that had barely kept fear from chewing at her bones. A customer at the garage threw a barbed joke: "Who's funding this hospitality?" and laughed in a way that tried to pass off sting as camaraderie. Jack's jaw tightened. He could have answered with the public charm he used to grease through social moments, but that felt like bargaining. Instead, he kept working, kept giving, kept the spare chair set. Grace took the slighted looks into her body and didn't speak of them except to Ethan, who asked why people stared sometimes. She told him children are like leaves. Some fall fast, some stay with the tree, and sometimes the wind just needs us to bend gently. Rumor is a slow rust that eats at wood and human hearts. It told a story that wasn't true, but gained traction because it fit a tidy narrative: a widower with money, a young mother who needed somewhere to land. People wrapped it in certainty, the kind that erases the texture of truth. Then the letters came. They arrived with a calm formality: crisp envelopes, the kind of paper that knows the weight of words. Jack received the first, an address on the return that belonged to a small law firm 2 towns over. He read it the way people read unfamiliar books: careful, frowning, searching for a line that might bring clarity. Inside was a single sheet, typed in black and unornamented. "We represent Miss Grace Miller. We are aware of recent public speculation regarding her situation. We are contacting those who have offered her help to ensure her safety and to clarify the facts. Please accept this as a request for discretion and, if possible, support." Lawyers' letters do not feel like gossip. They feel like a steady knock at a locked door. They also brought an offer. Would Jack be willing to meet one evening, not in the public square, but at the bakery, where the oven would offer a private warmth? When the lawyers came to the bakery, they did not appear like characters in a courtroom drama. They were 2 women who moved with practical efficiency and wore expressions tuned to methodical fact. They sat at a corner table under the dim lamps, and Grace, who had thought long about how to say the things that had kept her awake, sat with her hands folded, quiet but not shrinking. "We're not here to litigate your life in front of the town," one of the attorneys said, voice soft but clear. We're here to make sure that the people who have reached out to help understand what they're supporting and to protect the safety of Miss Miller and her son." She slid a small stack of pages across the table. Jack glanced down. The top sheet had a header, a case number, and a stamp. The words were plain: "Protective order issued, temporary. Custody filings pending. Recorded incidents of harassment. Police reports filed." There was no theatrical flourish, no damning proclamation. There were dates and times and numbers. There were also notes, medical assessments, a line confirming an earlier unrecorded shelter stay with the assistance of a nurse named Sarah Rowan 3 years prior. A yellowed photocopy of a hospital intake sheet showed a nurse's signature that matched the photograph on Jack's counter. Jack felt the photograph's presence become sudden, an intrusion of past kindness threading through the pages. He remembered now. Sarah had once, in a burst of empathy that seemed so much like who she had been, helped a young mother whose name she couldn't, who had been there in a night that had ended with a bandaged forehead and a small child calm in a swing. The town's memory did not keep small acts like a ledger, but paper did in its peculiar, stark way. Grace listened as the attorneys explained, not with legalese, but in human terms. "Her safety has been compromised in the past," one said. "There are court filings that prevent contact. She has been reluctant to speak publicly because doing so could put her or her son at risk. Those who knew her have been supportive. Others have made assumptions. We understand the town's concern. We ask for discretion and for support, and we wanted to give you, Mr. Rowan, the facts so you're not caught between rumor and what is real." Jack's first impulse was to protect. His rough hands closed into a fist under the table and then opened again. He remembered the nights he'd stood vigil by the hospital bed when Sarah couldn't breathe, the way small, competent hands had smoothed the forehead, and the way laughter had come back in the morning like birds. He also remembered the quiet of his pantry and the small rituals that had kept him afloat.
None of these things had prepared him for the way paper can make mercy look like a puzzle and a name look like a label. He asked questions that were practical. Will Grace's involvement in court mean more exposure? Will bringing them into the garage apartment put them at risk? The lawyers, steady, answered with a candor that respected vulnerability. Restraining orders are not guarantees. They are legal boundaries intended to keep a person from being harmed further. The filings were a record of existing danger, not an open verdict. The point was not to open an old wound, but to set it in a context that stopped the town from stitching a new narrative over it. When they had said what they needed to say, the room had a moment of the kind of silence that settles when rain finally eases. Grace pressed her palms to the table and, as if it had a name, let it go. "I didn't tell people," she said simply. "Not because I wanted to hide anything from Jack." She looked at him, and gratitude and something like apology flickered in her eyes. "But because every time I had to confirm what happened, it started a chain that followed us wherever we tried to go." "You shouldn't have had to say more than you wanted," Jack replied. He felt the town's weight lift a fraction from his shoulders and land on the same place where Grace had been carrying it all along. News traveled, but now it moved on a different current. Where rumor had earlier been loud and speculative, the lawyer's presence gave it a shape that invited, not pried. There were documents, there were facts, there were boundaries drawn to protect, not to dramatize. People who had leaned toward suspicion hesitated when presented with that quiet authority. Mrs. Kim brought over a casserole and an awkward apology. A man who had cracked jokes in the garage helped sweep the sidewalk in front of Sweet Grace Bakery the next Saturday. The principal at the elementary school called to confirm that Ethan was doing fine and that the teachers would help however they could. Small gestures multiplied like makeshift currency, each one an investment in a communal trust economy. Marcus put up a sign in the bakery window that read, "The first loaf is on us for the neighbors." People started coming in and buying bread for the single mom down the street because it felt like paying forward in cash rather than in gossip. Jack did not expect the lawyers to be heralded as saints. They had given no sermon. They had done their work, items on paper, signatures, dates. But what those pages did was make a pause in the town's conversation where truth could be placed without the glossy sheen of rumor. Grace did not become a figure of pity. She became a neighbor whose history had been complex and difficult. She became someone whose story included people who had helped her, like Sarah, and who now helped again. Time, that odd, indomitable healer, kept doing its work. Months collected. The bakery grew steady, its windows fogging in the morning as loaves came out and children pressed their faces to see the crusty centers. Lila and Ethan became a small duo of mischief and tenderness. They'd race to check the pie cooling on Marcus's rack, or secretly leave notes on the counter that said, "For you," with a little drawing of a sun. Jack found he could laugh again without feeling like he was betraying a silence. He still left the extra place at the diner. Sometimes Grace sat in the opposite chair with a coffee, and they talked of trivial things. How ovens had moods, how springs turned into dust in an old car's belly. And sometimes the conversation went deeper, to the quiet mechanics of repairing a life. Once, on a late afternoon when the sky bristled toward winter, the town came together in a way that felt like a seam finally taking. Marcus had the idea. On December 23rd, the bakery would host a free dinner for anyone who needed a warm meal. No one would be turned away. They would serve from the heart of their shop out into the icy air. The idea spread. The grocery store donated vegetables. The church offered loaner chairs. Jack and Grace found themselves planning a menu as if organizing an army for warmth. The town had a hand in it now. The rumor had been given the facts. The facts had allowed compassion the room to breathe. The night of the dinner, snow began as a sift, soft, uncommitted flakes that made the town look like everything had been washed fresh. They laid tables in the bakery and in the old hall next door, filled with mismatched chairs and a handmade garland with paper stars. Sarah's photograph was placed at a small table near the bakery's door, where a candle burned beside it. It was not meant as a show, but a quiet nod. Here was a kindness that had once been given and continued to echo. There were faces that had watched before. Mrs. Patterson with her casserole pans, and Mrs. Kim with her knitted scarves. There were people who ate alone, and people who found themselves sitting next to strangers who became friends by the end of the evening. Ethan danced between tables with the impulsive joy of a child who knows himself safe. Lila sat by Jack's side, explaining the science of snow to anyone who asked. Grace moved through the room serving bread, passing plates, laughing when someone tried to sneak a second helping. At one point, Jack stepped outside to clear his throat, and then to breathe. The air was a sharp honesty that felt like being washed. He noticed a few people lingering at the edge of the crowd, those who had once stared with suspicion. One stepped forward, cheeks red from the cold and from the admission, and cleared her throat. I was wrong," she said, voice smaller than the room's clatter. "I saw things and I said things. I'm sorry." Another woman came up, hands folded. "We didn't understand," she said. "We looked at fear and made a story out of it. I'm sorry, too." Jack nodded. He felt no need to be theatrical. The town answered with small deeds. A neighbor hung lights that finally made the street feel less like an alley at night and more like a place with a welcome. Each act was a small ledger entry of belief. In time, the community's narrative shifted from rumor to record. It was not that everyone forgot to be distrustful. That would be a lie. But the lawyer's sober pages had allowed a protective logic to replace the hunger for gossip. The truth, held on paper and explained with human voices, made a space for compassion to grow without the weight of misunderstanding. The Christmas before the bakery officially opened its own storefront, Jack stood in a doorway with Sarah's photograph in one hand and a warm pastry in the other. He watched Grace move among people, teaching a new girl at the counter how to fold dough so it would rise right. He felt both the tug of the past and the buoyancy of what had been offered in the present. Lila ran to Ethan, who had perfected the moment of being both conspirator and best friend, and they sprinted past a table full of donated coats and a corner where a woman was sitting with a blanket around her knees, someone who had been helped that day without a spotlight. At the end of the night, someone moved a stack of chairs and set them around a long table in the hall. Every chair had a story. Jack pulled out the extra one across from where he sat, the same ritual as always, and set it gentle. He didn't say anything about Sarah. It would have been both too much and too little. But he lit the candle beside the photograph, and, as if the soft flame might carry his voice in its small, persistent way, he raised his glass to the empty place. The room hummed with ordinary music, children fussing, dishes, the soft murmur of conversation that becomes holy when people choose to show up. Someone began to sing, not perfectly, but with a conviction that defied the need for harmonic proof. The song drifted like warmth. People reached across the table to pass plates, to share stories, to offer a hand. The empty chair did not remain a symbol only of what had been lost. It had become a place of invitation, a place where kindness had found room to sit again. Outside, the snow fell thicker, writing a quiet on the roofs and the corners. Inside, a child painted a paper star and stuck it to the wall above the door. Someone else pinned a handwritten note, "Pull up a chair, you are welcome here." Jack thought of Sarah and of all the small kindnesses he had been given and given in turn. He thought of Grace, whose courage was not a headline but a steady page turned in the face of danger. He thought of the lawyers, not invaders, but people who had brought practical truth that allowed a town to reframe its story. He thought of rumor and its appetite for a clean ending, and of the messy, ongoing work of community. If anyone had asked him, he would not have said he felt healed. He would have said he had found a way to sit with loss and presence at once. That, he felt, was some kind of blessing, modest, earned, and warm. The last thing that night was not a speech, but a quiet. People stood and began to clear plates, to stack chairs, to laugh at some small shared memory. Grace and Jack lingered by the counter. Ethan was asleep in someone's arms, a small weight of peace. Lila kept messing with the photograph frame as if to make sure Sarah was steady in her watch. "Thank you," Grace said to Jack, voice low. It was not sudden drama. It was the small, honest gratitude of someone whose life had been reknit by the patience of others. Jack looked at the photo, at the candle, at the busy hands folding napkins and stacking trays. He thought of the second place set at his table, how it had allowed new patterns to form without erasing the old. He thought of truth, how dangerous yet necessary it is, how it can protect rather than shame when held by careful hands. "You're welcome," he said, "and thank you for staying." They did not promise perfect endings. They promised, in plain deeds, to keep showing up. That was a vow with more power than a sentence on paper or a rumor shouted in a parking lot. It had the weight of coffee on a cold morning, of a loaf of bread handed across a counter, of a chair pulled out where someone might come to sit. It had the kind of persistence that changes towns, one small act after another, a chain not of spectacle but of steady presence. Outside, the snow softened the town's sharp edges into gentleness. Inside, the long table was a display of a different kind of wealth, the abundance of people who moved toward one another when the world felt frayed. The lawyers' papers had done what they could. They had provided facts and boundaries. The rest of it, the repair, the rebuilding, was human work. It was the work of neighbors and bakers and a mechanic who kept a place set for the one he had loved and thereby made room for others to be loved too. As the evening wound down and boxes were packed away, Jack took the photograph from the little table, wiped a faint smudge from its glass with the back of his hand, and then set it carefully back. He pulled the second chair a little closer to the table and left it there, an invitation open and uncomplicated. The last image the town carried that night was small but clear. Chairs around a table, some filled, some waiting.
each one a testament that when truth is told kindly and when hands are offered without calculation, a community can learn to hold people gently. Acts of kindness, once given, ripple outward. The paper that had offered protection had allowed the town to change its story. The empty chair had become something else, a place to start again. If you feel this story, let it be a small prompting. Pull up a chair somewhere. Show up. Share truth kindly. Subscribe to stories of real people who choose to meet one another.
And if you can, find a way to do a quiet, practical kindness this week. Bring a warm meal, lend an hour, or tell someone the truth when rumor tries to speak for them. The chain begins with one small gesture. It keeps going with the next.